staff and students to MITT's presentation on the Black History Month. The theme for 2023 is Ours to Tell. So with that, this theme represents both an opportunity to engage in open dialogue and a commitment to learning more about the stories Black communities in Canada have to tell about their histories, successes, sacrifices, and triumphs. With that, I'm going to introduce our speaker today. We have Phyllis Reid-Jarvis, an MITT instructor who will be sharing about her journey, the impact of Black excellence on the community, and the importance of self-leadership. This presentation, as I mentioned, will take approximately 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A. Phyllis has over 25 years of combined experience in health, leadership, and social justice. Phyllis brings this knowledge, skills, and experiences to organizations committed to implementing transformational leadership practices. Phyllis's career spans beyond MITT, where she's working internationally, nationally, and locally in leadership and talent development. With that, Phyllis, I turn this over to you.
Thank you so much, Dalvinder and Leslie. I'd like to welcome the ancestors who lived in this land where we are now. And I welcome and acknowledge that I am speaking from Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the MITT Nation. I acknowledge that Manitoba is located on the original lands of the Nehiyawak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, Athabaskan, Métis, and Inuit peoples. I acknowledge that the water we drink in this city is from Shoal Lake, and I acknowledge and respect the treaties that were made on these territories, and I'm committed to working in partnership with First Nation, Métis, and Inuit peoples in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I welcome and invite the spirits of the Nehiyawak, the Anishinaabe, Dakota, Athabaskan, Métis, and Inuit peoples to guide us as we embark on our learning journeys today. So I ran into a professor of mine about 25 years after graduating from university. She didn't recognize me. I recognized her and said hello, reintroducing myself. The older of my two sons were with me. She was thrilled. At least that's what her tone and her body language conveyed to me. We talked. She shared how much she enjoyed following my career. And she also shared how much she has kept all the articles that featured me over the years. She even went on to say how much she enjoyed my radio show. She then turned to my son and she said, and I quote, "You must be so proud of your mom. She's done so many wonderful things for our profession," end of quote. We bid each other well and said our goodbyes. In the safety of our car, I turned to my son and I said, "Son, I have a story to tell you." Good afternoon, everyone. It is an honor and privilege to share with you in this year's Black History Month celebrations. I want to thank MITT for asking me to share my story, and for all of you who have come to participate in this month's Black History Month celebrations. As Dalvinder and Leslie mentioned, I will be sharing my personal and my professional journey, understanding the journey to excellence when you're Black in Canada, its impact on the community, and the importance of self-leadership. So my professional journey has been filled with varying experiences. And now, hindsight, when I'm looking back, all have prepared me really well for where I am today. The word circuitous best describes my path. It began at Michael Teachers College in Kingston, Jamaica, where I started training preparations to become a science teacher. Alas, this was interrupted when I immigrated to Canada in 1985 with my parents. Upon arriving in Manitoba, I decided to switch career paths and pursue becoming a registered dietitian, a career in which I had almost 20 years. And despite having significant success as a registered dietitian, it was fraught with many barriers of exclusion, just the need for more available and culturally appropriate mentoring and support to help me understand the Canadian culture and its practices of professionalism. It's really funny how life always seems to come full circle. Thanks again to MITT, I now get to instruct international students in courses designed to prepare them for the Canadian workplace and for understanding Canadian culture, many of whom are the same age I was when I first arrived in Manitoba almost 40 years ago. So a few highlights of my own career. So as a registered dietitian, it includes publishing 2 books on solutions for health, working with CBC Radio as a health columnist. I had a column called Food for Thought, and representing my national association in Granada, Spain, at the annual International Congress for Dietetics. 43 countries tend to gather every year. I was one of the speakers and presenters there representing my national association, board member for Breakfast for Learning Canada, among a few things. So that's a little bit of my story, but I am just a speck when we think about the story of my people and my community. And it actually is an African story, which is as old as time itself. So our excellence goes way back from before, really, I'd like to say before time. So I just want to share a few highlights. I'm a little bit of a geek when it comes on to ancient history, so bear with me here, please. So what we're looking at here, this is the what's called the Great Zimbabwe. Some of you might have heard about it. It's built by indigenous Bantu-speaking African ancestors, the Shona people, during the 11th century Common Era. And it expanded for more than 300 years. Today, this incredible structure, if any of you've ever been, you'll see how just incredibly tall these columns are. They're built with stones that are called megalithic stones. They're massive, hundreds of tons, and you can barely get a piece of paper to go through each stone. So it was built with technology that we don't have here today. And as I said, it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site today. It is a timeless testament to the Shona people's ingenuity and one of the world's many architectural wonders. This next photo that you're seeing is one of its pyramids. I'm sure that you're seeing that. And it's located in a country known to have the most pyramids in the world. I want to give you a couple seconds, and if you know the name of this country, please put it in the chat, and let's see what we've come up with. Just make a guess there. So let me know if there's any responses in the chat, Dal or Leslie. Not seeing any. Oh, there's one. Alrighty, let's. Ooh, yes, someone got it. So if you said Sudan, you are right. So this country, Sudan, has over 250 pyramids compared to Egypt's 138. So we are more familiar with the pyramids in Egypt. This style that we're looking at here is called the Nubian style of pyramids, and it was built by African rulers of the ancient Kushite kingdoms. So African excellence is as old as time, and there's more. So let's take a peek here to your left of the screen. These are statues of Nubian leaders, many of whom were also pharaohs in Egypt. And then we're looking in the middle here, this beautiful piece that is etched in stone. So it is timeless. This is an etching of Prince Hakhanifer, who actually is making a homage or a homage to the tomb of King Tutankhamun, whom we know as King Tut, and bringing some tribute for King Tut. This is back in the 18th dynasty. King Tut is the grandson of this pharaoh here, Amenhotep III, and he is known to be the father of another famous pharaoh, one of my favorites actually, who is Pharaoh Akhenaten. So I'm not going to geek you out too much on ancient history, but I always like to ground the history of people of African descent, not in the history of slavery, because that's 400 years of our entire histories. And as I said, African excellence is as old as time. It goes way, way, way back. Now, sadly, due to erasure of African excellence, many accomplishments were attributed to non-Africans. And as I said, I'm not going to go too much into that, but this is just a few pieces just to set us up. So thinking about the fact that some of our excellence has been erased, it actually reminds me of a quotation from our Canadian author, and her name is Essie Ejiowan. And she speaks to the fact that this was in her book entitled Out of the Sun on Race and Storytelling, which, by the way, is an amazing example of Canadian excellence and accomplishment. She and her work, she's been twice winner of the Scotiabank Giller Prize. Her novel, Washington Black, was a bestseller, finalist for the Man Booker Prize, and as well was pegged on New York Times Book Review as one of the 10 best books of the year. So Essie, born and raised in Calgary, Alberta, and she reminds us that a past of which we don't speak, somehow in its silence, powerfully shape the present, which brings us to some current times. And I'd like to share a little bit with you how Africans became Black. We say Black History Month. Not very many folks might know the origin of the word Black in this context. So let's look at some current times and how Africans became Black. So this is Essie Ejiowan here, reading from her incredible novel, Washington Black, Canadian excellence right there. So I arrived in Manitoba to discover that I was Black. See, coming from a culture where one identifies with their country of origin, some people identify with their religion, but we identified with our country of origin, I was taken aback by others' need to reduce me to the superficiality of the color of my skin. And the silent racism below the surface of friendly Manitoba struck me deeply. How did people who look like me come to be identified by the color of their skin? How did people today who identify as white, brown, red, yellow, how did they come to be identified by the color of their skin? How can excellence be determined by the color of one's skin, while in the same breath, we are taught that, for example, beauty is only skin deep, right? Or you might have heard this one, we can't judge a book by its cover. And my all-time favorite is this, all that glitter is not gold. So something was awry, and I needed to do some research. So thinking about excellence, excellence in any culture is built on the pillars of learning, community building, and courage to see what others fail to see, say what others fail to say, and take action when others are feeling that they prefer to stay within the known. So these qualities are not relegated to any one particular culture or group of people. They're present in all cultures. So this reminds me of the story of this gentleman. So we're going back into the 1940s now, and name is Anatole Broyard. And this gentleman here is an interesting story. It's one that speaks to African excellence denied by the dominant society's need to be white. So racial passing, usually seen as Blackness passing as whiteness, remains true even today, since the history of Africans and their relationships with Europeans. Anatole Broyard, an accomplished literary critic and writer for the New York Times, kept his Blackness quiet. He passed as white and went on to create a career that was built on excellence, never revealing this part of his life to anyone but his white Norwegian wife. His children discovered his Blackness on the day of his death, hid his Blackness. It also reminds me of another gentleman going back to the 40s and 50s, George Harriman. Now, he too was born to, at the time, the term Creole was used to describe folks who are very, very light-skinned. It's not an appropriate term today, but that is what the biography says. So born to these folks in the southern US, and he too kept his Blackness quiet also. He passed as a Greek, an accomplished literary figure, known and respected widely as a cartoonist for many of the prestigious newspapers in the USA. And this also reminds me of the tragic story of Elsie Roxborough, another lost African excellence. She was admired by many for her beauty and talent as both an actor as well as a writer. But she gave up on both careers after failing to secure acting roles or to get her work published. She moved to New York, where she changed her name to Mona Monet, and there she lived life as a white woman. So to my earlier questions, why Black? Why white? Why red? Or why yellow or brown? The short answer is this: the assignment of color to different groups of people is a political statement and not a biological fact. I know this, I was being prepared to be a science teacher back then. So Black in reference to people of African descent is a political and economic statement that's grounded in the sole purpose of exploitation of resources from indigenous peoples globally. This includes the colonization and oppression of the world's peoples of African ancestry. Black is a statement that speaks to the social and economic oppression of Africans. Black is not a country. Black, like all other colors assigned to humans, is not a culture. There is no culture in color, none at all. The historical records dating back to the social creation of racism and consequently races showed us that races were created by science to justify the social and economic exploitation of peoples of African communities. And we know of other communities. Today I'm invited to speak about my own community. So the act of race creation is secondary to exploitation. It was and still is not the cause of the exploitation of Africans. So let's fast forward to the 1960s. So with the legal form of slavery abolished in the British colonies, this includes Canada as well. I'll say a little bit more about this later on. Africans in North and South America, Europe, and Caribbean countries created an outlet for expressing their pride and love of self. All this was against the social miseducation of the word Black being associated with negative rather than with beauty, success, and excellence. Now, although if your bank account is in the black, that's really good. Or if you struck black gold, that also is really good. Now, people of African heritage set about to reclaim the word Black as beautiful. Out of this were born phrases such as I'm Black and I'm proud, or I'm Black, say it out loud. And more recently, since 2013, when Alicia Garza posted the phrase hashtag Black Lives Matter on her social media page, it has evolved into a political pushback to prevailing white supremacy. So the takeaway from this look back, so we did ancient history, now we're doing a little bit more recent history in the 60s. The purpose of this look back into how Africans became Black is simply this: colonizers and oppressors needed to justify their actions. They needed to convince the populace that white was the standard and all other shades of color were inferior. They needed to build a hierarchical system of color, thus pitting one color group against the other. And this is what's used to ensure the system of oppression and colonization would be upheld. Now, for this to happen, African excellence and African humanity and contributions to societies worldwide had to be retold. In certain cases, in many cases, had to be erased. Or for Africans such as Anatole Broyard here, George Harriman, Elsie Roxborough, and millions more who were light enough to pass as white, it meant the abandonment of their true roots just to live more freely. Now, do you remember the story I promised to tell my son? Here goes. So I was in my final year of my university studies. Pretty good student, getting A's and B pluses in most of my courses. In fact, one year I even received the Alumni Association Award for high grade point average with $500. And this is like more than 30 years ago. So you know that's a lot of money back then. I was thrilled. And so that brought quite a bit of honor and so on. But for some reason, I could only seem to get at best a low B plus from this professor. So to pursue my career as a registered dietitian, among other criteria for acceptance into the program, I needed appropriate references. So this professor, who was highly respected and regarded in the field, I figured if I could get her on board, give me a reference, I'm a shoe in for one of those coveted 16 positions. That's all they would take across the country. So I booked an appointment to ask this professor if she would stand as a referee for me. Without skipping a beat, she said, and I quote, "Sure, but I don't think you'd like what I have to say." End of quote. I was a little puzzled. I said, "What do you mean?" She looked me in the eye and said, and I quote again, "We don't want your kind in our program." End of quote. Still puzzled. I'm here thinking, geez, I'm too young. She probably thinks I'm just too young. Oh, but then I said, "Oh, what do you mean?" And she did this. She held up her arm and she ran her fingers back and forth over it. Took me a couple of seconds. Remember, I came from a country where I identify with my country, not the color of my skin. Then it dawned on me, and I said to her, "Do you mean because of the color of my skin?" And she did this. She leaned back in her chair. The meeting was over. Left the room. So this meeting and this interaction was one of the most blatant forms of denial of representation that I had ever experienced, as well as the abuse of power designed to prevent me from realizing my full potential. And when I was preparing this, it reminded me of this quote by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And again, I did promise to speak a bit about self-leadership. And this quote by Dr. Martin Luther King, who offers us a timeless example of Black excellence worldwide and excellence in leadership, sums up the importance of why we need to embrace leadership if we are going to move past superficialities such as the color of our skin, accents, and so on. So self-leadership is what led millions of people worldwide to speak out against the injustices meted out to people of African descent, as well, whether these injustices are happening on the continent of Africa itself, or in the UK, or in North America, South America. It doesn't matter where. No matter where, it requires self-leadership to see the humanity in another person. So thinking back to my own upbringing, I am fortunate to belong to a family and community that taught me early in life that I need to be proud of who I am and not to conform to society's ideals of whom they think I should be. This self-leadership was taught to me early in my life, and it's my mom who, my dad unfortunately passed when I was but a toddler, and so my mom was just that model. She's my hero. And so I have used those lessons taught to me early in my life throughout my entire life. I use them to transform barriers into opportunities. And this is a crucial mindset that I continue to use today and teach, coach, and mentor others to adopt as a transformative tool, including to my 2 sons, my nieces, nephews, friends, and my students. My students will tell you, it doesn't matter what the course is that I'm teaching, there's a component of self-leadership as to how will you take this content that you're learning and apply it in a way when you're in an organization so that you make it easier for others to navigate their way through the organizations. So as I come to a close, I'd like to return to Canada and share a snippet of the wide-ranging level and depth of African excellence right here at home. So I want to go back to Essie Ejewin. You can tell I quite like her as an author. So in her book, Out of the Sun on Race and Storytelling, Essie has a chapter titled Canada and the Art of Ghosts. And I'm going to read you a little snippet from that section. Here goes. Slavery is not one of the ghost stories of our nation, but it should be. Its history does not haunt us. And even today, I'd argue that the average Canadian knows persistently little about it. We tend to think it did not exist here. But Canada might not have been a slave society, but it was a society with slaves. It shared this feature with virtually all other New World societies. End of quote. So this commentary by Essie rings true and drives home the importance of Dr. Martin Luther King's quote. It brings to mind this South African proverb. Again, one of my favorite, Umuntu engumuntu engabantu, which means a person is a person through other people. So through a strong community of people of African, European, Asian, and Indigenous descents, the following Canadians are persons who are trailblazers. Not only do they bring great pride and recognition to our country, in spite of, at times, their country seeing them only as the color of their skin. They're leaders in their fields. They contribute to Canada's success in myriad ways, such as social, economic, educational, the sciences, arts, politics, to name but a few. So Black excellence is Canadian excellence. So this gentleman here is dubbed the next Barack Obama. He actually goes by the name Balarama Holness and also known as Stephen Holness. He's a politician and a former Canadian football safety. He actually was originally signed by the Winnipeg Blue Bomber as an undrafted free agent back in 2008. He won a Grey Cup for the Montreal Alouettes and back in 2010. So Mr. Holness here is just breaking grounds in leveling the playing field for all Canadians. Next to him is the unstoppable Julian Christian Lutz. So this gentleman is known professionally, as Director X. He's a Canadian filmmaker, commercial director, music video director, television director, having directed more than 100 music videos, and widely known as a prolific director in the industry. He's also directed feature films and television series. And of course, he's telling his people's stories as well as the story of Canada through the lens of an African. And this young woman here This is Dr. Canola Williams. And by the way, Mr. Holness here, born in 1975. I believe Julian, he's born 75 as well. But Dr. Williams here, born in 1975. There's a trend here, ladies and gentlemen. So Dr. Canola Williams, born in Manitoba, Winnipeg, Manitoba, in 1975, completed her undergraduate and master's degrees in microbiology at the University of Manitoba, completed her PhD in immunology at the University of Alberta. And her work demonstrated that the Ebola vaccine works to prevent Ebola infection and can help recovery even after being infected. And this beautiful woman just so happens to be my cousin, by the way. And this gentleman that you're seeing here is, let me just move this out the way so I'd like to use my little cursor, there we go, is Felix Uze Ali-Jazim, and born in 2000. So we're seeing the trend still continuing here. And he is a Canadian professional tennis player. He's the third youngest player that is ranked the top 10 by the Association of Tennis Professionals, and has a career high singles ranking of number 6, which he achieved just last year. He's quite young, making him the second highest ranked Canadian man in the Association of Tennis Players rankings history, and the 4th highest ranked Canadian player in history. But it doesn't end here. Canadian Black excellence is Canadian excellence. It still continues. And we see it in this young woman here. So we're looking at Kayla Gray. She graduated from the College of Sports Media in Toronto. They're all Canadian born, by the way. She quickly climbed to the ranks of the sports news world. You might have seen her because she's covered the news from Winnipeg to Prince Rupert, just across the country. You can also catch her on TSN. Kayla is known for covering the Raptors' historic NBA championship win. Some of you might have caught that. This beautiful woman here, Vanessa Antoine, again, Toronto born, and she made television history as the first Black Canadian woman to star in an hour-long Canadian series. While that title is long overdue, Antoine continues to lead the CBC series as it continues in its 2nd season. And I want to quote what she has to say. I quote, she says, "It feels great to be the first, but it also gives me pause and a question a lot of things." End of quote. She also went on to say that I didn't see the world I lived in reflected in television, that it's about time, and that hopefully this is the beginning of a bigger change. End of quote. This gorgeous woman here is Cheryl Thompson. When it comes to the history of Black beauty in Canada, Cheryl Thompson is an expert. She's a Ryerson University professor who turned her academic dissertation into a book called Beauty in a Box, Detangling the Roots of Canada's Black Beauty Culture. The book focuses on Black women's hair and how it intersects with Canadian immigration, politics, and society. And Thompson explained her reasoning behind her important research, and I quote her. She says that in Canada, we don't tend to think of Black communities as being proactive. There tends to be a narrative that things just happen to us. The reality is that all African Americans selling products wouldn't have been able to come to Canada if the infrastructure didn't exist. End of quote. And this other woman here is Claudette McGowan. She gives the stereotypical bank executive in a suit a run for their money, pun intended. As the Chief Information Officer at the Bank of Montreal, McGowan is a powerful leader in information technology. Her CV is just as impressive as you might think. But before starting at BMO in 2000, she worked at Deloitte, Metropolitan Police Services, North York General Hospital. She's a recipient of many accolades, such as WXN Canada's Most Powerful Women Top 100 Award. She's interviewed folks like Michelle Obama. And get this, in her spare time, she writes children's books. So Black excellence is Canadian excellence. And I want to wrap things up here, as I said, but I couldn't without including Marion Croak. She's not Canadian, she's American by birth. But her story is worth sharing. It's really critical. Very, very fitting to share a bit of her story with you, because without her genius and her excellence, we would not be in this medium. I wouldn't be able to be in my home, you're in your home, and here we are together in one platform. Marion Croak is a prolific inventor in the voice and data communication fields with over 200 patents to her name. She's best known for developing voice over internet protocols, or VoIP, as we tend to call it, technology. And that converts our voices into digital signals that allows us to make a call directly from our computers or through other digital devices. She currently works as vice president in the engineering group at Google. And get this, in this role, she's responsible for what the internet is capable of doing around the world and increasing access to internet in emerging economies. Absolutely powerful. So Black excellence, whether it's in Canada, in Africa, South America, wherever it happens, is excellence that does contribute to humanity and contribute to societies. And it's important that we not get lost in the danger of a single story as only one group that's responsible for bringing the world to where it is today. We all play a part in it. I'm going to invite you to maybe take a picture of this slide. So this is author and activist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, a Nigerian, just a prolific literary writer and just world-renowned. She speaks very eloquently of the danger of a single story. Some of you might be familiar with this particular piece of her work, but I invite you to check it out. The link is here. It's a beautiful and powerful TED Talk. So my overarching goal for today's knowledge sharing is this. We must be deliberately mindful, as I said, of the danger of a single story. And Chimamanda, as I said, just reminds us of that beautifully in that TED Talk. And I'll let her take us to the close with these final words. So as you look at the slide, I just want to remind you why I do what I do. I do this work because I know all lives matter, including Black African Canadians' lives. And I want to significantly normalize and make this known to fellow Manitobans and Canadians. I will know we are successful when, as Manitobans, we no longer are governed by blatant or worse, silent racism in our communities, in our workplaces, and especially in our learning institutions. Success is realized when the TRC's calls to action are fully implemented. Success is realized when marginalized Manitobans, that's persons with a variety of disabilities, visible and invisible disabilities, members of 2S LGBTQIA+ groups, as well as equity-seeking Manitobans. These are persons who self-identify as persons of color, Asian, African, Caribbean, or African Caribbean, or Black, when they share 100% freedom, just like their fellow white Canadians. And as Chimamanda is reminding us, we do not need first to be perfect before we can do what is right and just. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phyllis. Everyone's clapping.
Mhm.
I'm just I want to say thank you firstly, and you shared a lot of important points. A lot stuck with me, and I know it's Q&A, and I'm just curious to hear what happened after that professor's office, like with that incident. And yeah, I'm curious, and I'm sure others are curious too. Yeah, firstly, I guess if you want to start with that. And then
Sure.
everyone, I will let you guys also ask questions. You can send it to myself, Leslie, or you can also unmute yourself. But I would just say maybe raise your hands in case there's a lot of questions so that we can all take turns.
Fantastic. Yeah, so what happened after I had that interaction with my professor is this. I slinked out of her office, went down into the students' washroom, locked myself in the washroom, and I bawled my eyes out. I wept. So that was what happened immediately after. Now, 25 years after, when I ran into her with my son, and I shared this story with him. And at the end, he said, Mom, why did you speak to her then? You shouldn't have spoken to her. And my response to him was, Son, the best gift you can give your enemy is to rise above their expectations of you. He's like, I don't understand that. I just think you should not have spoken to her. But that is what happened immediately after. And now he's older, he absolutely gets it. So
Thank you. You're such a positive, person, and always focusing on that. I think we all appreciate that.
thank you.
I'm just checking the chat for questions. Everyone's just really thanking you and for being inspirational. Does anyone have questions they would like to ask live? I don't see any hands up, so you could maybe unmute yourself. I see a chat. Someone just sent me a message, Phyllis. What is one recommendation you have for us?
That's a really great question. And it's really, really simple because I'm an educator. I have always been in this field of learning, whether it's directly working with others or I myself, I'm a student. So I'm a student for life. It's just something that I've embodied, I've embraced. So the ones first, there's lots of things, but the most important piece is learn. Learn about your history. We all have histories. And I would say take the time to just delve into your history. Look at it from all different sides, because history is usually written by those who they say have conquered or the winners. And if I am a winner, I'm going to write a history that's very favorable for me. And yet, as I showed you in some of the slides, some history and many, many histories have been etched in stone. So in our language, in the English language, sometimes we'll say, hey, it's not carved in stone, meaning that it's not permanent. Well, guess what? There's lots of histories, like the Great Zimbabwe's, the pyramids, the hieroglyphs, and so on. They're written in stone. And so we have histories that have been written, and so learn about it. That would be my one recommendation. And learn about your own history first, how you're centered, the rest of the world. Take the time to learn a bit about others' histories as well. Don't be afraid to ask questions. I really think that some of my white colleagues, they've said to me, Phyllis, I don't know what to say. I don't know, what if I say something wrong? What if I stumble and offend the person? And I always say to them, the best thing that you can do is to ask the question and let them know you're coming from a place of genuine curiosity and that genuine desire to learn. People are reasonable. That is my take in life. Glass is always half full for me. So people are really interested in you when you show genuine interest in them and learning, not because they are some anomaly or exotic or anything like that, but human to human. Umuntu and Gabantu, right? A person is a person through others. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. You also shared about the importance of self-leadership, and you mentioned how your son initially, when he was younger, how he responded to the story. So there's still likely struggles on the journey of being resilient. Any tips about that? On that?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. Thank you for asking it, because it's not an easy journey. I mean, life itself is not easy. So I would say one of the most important tips that has really helped me, I actually teach it, coach it to others, shared it with my sons, they practice it, is self-care. And self-care might, for some people, seem overused, that word. Yet if we are going into the world, and sometimes it can be a battlefield. If you notice, even in times of war, folks are pulled off the fields so that they can recoup, they can rejuvenate, right? I'm not a fan of wars, but nonetheless, it's an example that comes to mind. So I would say one of the most important things we can do for ourselves is care for ourselves. So it comes back to the airplane when we're flying. Before they take off, we get the instructions. In the event of a drop of pressure in the cabin, oxygen masks will come out of the bins. Put your masks on first before helping anyone else, including your children. Our natural tendency is to want to take care of our children. But if we're not full, if we don't have enough in us, we have nothing to give to others. So that requires a lot of self-care, Dalvinder, but it also requires a lot of self-leadership, because you have to set those priorities and make them just a part of your day-to-day practice and routine. So that's what I would say is number one.
I do agree, and I guess self-care and reflection go hand in hand. I do see one last question in the chat. It's about, is there a story behind African versus Black history?
Yeah, and I believe I touched on it a little bit in my presentation when I asked the question, why Black, why red, why yellow, and so on and so forth. So and I also said that there's no culture in color. Like when you say white, it doesn't tell us the culture. What it tells us is the political history of whiteness. When you say Black, it doesn't give you culture. It gives you the political and economic history of what it means to be assigned that color, red, yellow, and so on. So that's why it's important for us to understand, you hear me interchange between Black and African. So if I'm going to speak to you about my community, it is a community of African Caribbean history. When I say African Caribbean, immediately you can place me geographically, you can place me culturally, spiritually, you name it. And that is culture. So that is the backstory between Black and white, yellow, red, and so on are struggles, the political struggles, and they have their place in our society. But we're not defined just by our struggles. As I showed you in the earlier slides and the current day slides, we have so much more to us as humans. And so it's important for me as an educator, again, to remind folks, let's learn about true culture. Our culture is not a culture of slavery. Our culture has enslavement as part of it, small part, but it is not the whole. So that's the backstory behind it.
Thank you so much, Phyllis.